Sometimes the hardest choices we make, as parents, grandparents, or caregivers, happen in a single moment that changes everything. The weight of knowing you could help someone, but breaking the rules to do it, can haunt you for decades. Retired Nurse Marsha Coleman knows this feeling all too well. 40 years ago, she met a teenage girl with severe knee pain that no doctor could explain. The girl was dismissed by everyone as attention-seeking. But Marsha saw something different. She made a choice that went against hospital policy and could have ended her career. What she did in that room saved the girl's life. Now her own granddaughter shows up limping from a soccer injury, and all those old memories come flooding back. But the real question isn't what Marsha did all those years ago. What price did her act of compassion really cost? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through salt-stained windows of Marsha Coleman's weathered cottage, casting dancing patterns across the hand-knitted afghan draped over her favorite armchair. At 65, she had settled into rhythms as predictable as the tides that lapped against the rocky Maine coast just beyond her kitchen door. The Afghan, worked in soft blues and greens during countless winter evenings, had become more than mere decoration. It was a testament to patience, to the careful accumulation of small, deliberate stitches that created something beautiful and lasting. Marsha wrapped her fingers around her morning tea mug, feeling the familiar warmth seep through. The ceramic. Earl Grey, always Earl Grey, steeped for exactly 4 minutes. The routine anchored her, kept the restless memories at bay. Through the window, she watched fishing boats bob in the harbor, their masts swaying like metronomes against the pewter sky. This view had been her solace for 15 years, ever since she'd left her nursing career behind and sought refuge in this quiet coastal town where nobody asked uncomfortable questions about the past. The cottage itself seemed to exhale the domestic scent of decades, salt air, old wood, and the lingering ghost of countless meals prepared in the compact kitchen. Marsha had chosen this place deliberately for its simplicity, its distance from the sterile hallways and fluorescent lighting of hospitals where she'd spent 40 years of her life. Here, surrounded by weathered cedar shingles and the constant murmur of waves, she could almost convince herself that those years had belonged to someone else entirely. But this particular Tuesday morning brought an unwelcome disruption to her carefully constructed peace. The crunch of gravel in her driveway announced an unexpected visitor, and Marsha's heart quickened with the particular anxiety of someone who valued solitude above most other comforts. She peered through the lace curtains to see a battered Honda Civic that she recognized with a mixture of joy and concern. Emma climbed out of the driver's seat with visible difficulty, favoring her right leg as she gathered a duffel bag from the back seat. 16 years old and tall for her age, she moved with the careful precision of someone managing pain while trying to appear normal. Her dark hair, so similar to Marsha's at that age, fell in waves around her face as she limped toward the front door. Marsha was already moving, setting down her tea and smoothing her cotton sweater as she hurried to open the door before Emma had to knock. The girl stood on the weathered welcome mat, her face a careful mask of teenage composure that didn't quite hide the vulnerability underneath. "Hi, Grandma," Emma said, attempting a smile that wavered slightly at the edges. "I hope it's okay, that? I just showed up. Mom said you probably wouldn't mind." "Of course it's okay, sweetheart." Marsha stepped aside, studying her granddaughter with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades assessing patients. The slight pallor, the way Emma held herself, the almost imperceptible wince as she shifted her weight, all of it registered with the automatic precision of old habits. "Though I have to ask, what brings you all the way up here? And what happened to your leg?" Emma's laugh held a note of bitterness unusual for her age. "Soccer injury. At least, that's what everyone keeps calling it. 3 weeks ago, during practice, My knee just gave out during a drill. She paused, seeming to consider how much to reveal. The thing is, it hasn't gotten better. If anything, it's worse. As Emma settled into the living room, sinking gratefully into the cushioned embrace of Marsha's couch, the older woman found herself transported back through decades of similar scenes. How many times had she encountered young patients whose pain was minimized, whose concerns were brushed aside with patronizing reassurances? The familiar weight of professional instinct settled over her shoulders, like a cloak she thought she'd permanently discarded. "Tell me about it," Marsha said, settling across from Emma with the Afghan spread across her lap. "What exactly does it feel like?" Emma's eyes lit up with surprise and relief. Clearly, this was not the response she'd grown accustomed to receiving. "It's like there's something fundamentally wrong in there. Not just soreness from overuse, but like the whole joint is angry. It throbs at night, and sometimes I get this sharp shooting pain that makes my whole leg go weak." She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "I've seen 3 doctors. They all say it's normal healing, that I'm being dramatic. Mom thinks I'm using it as an excuse to avoid going back to school." The words hit Marsha with unexpected force. She'd heard variations of this story countless times during her nursing career. Young women whose pain was dismissed, whose symptoms were attributed to hysteria or attention-seeking behavior. The medical establishment's casual disregard for female patients, particularly teenagers, had been one of the frustrations that had driven her to advocacy, sometimes to the point of professional risk. "Your mother sent you here?" Marsha asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Not exactly." Emma's cheeks flushed slightly. "We had a fight about it yesterday. She said I was being dramatic, that I needed to toughen up and get back to normal life. So I got in my car and started driving. I didn't really have a plan until I ended up on Route 1, and then I just kept going until I got here." Marsha nodded, understanding more than Emma probably realized. Her daughter Rebecca had always been practical to a fault, inheriting her father's tendency to view emotions as inconveniences to be managed rather than experiences to be honored. It was a trait that had served Rebecca well in her corporate career, but had created friction in her relationships, particularly with her more sensitive daughter. "Wow, I'm glad you came," Marsha said, meaning it completely. "You're always welcome. Here, you know that. And we'll figure out what's going on with your knee." As Emma relaxed visibly at this acceptance, Marsha felt something stirring in her chest that she hadn't experienced in years. The old familiar pull of professional purpose, the desire to advocate for a patient who wasn't being heard. It was a feeling she'd thought she'd successfully buried along with her nursing career, but apparently some instincts never fully disappeared. The afternoon stretched ahead of them, filled with the comfortable rhythms of shared domestic space. Emma helped prepare lunch despite her mobility limitations, and they fell into the easy conversation that had always characterized their relationship. Emma had been Marsha's first grandchild, and there had always been a special connection between them, perhaps because Emma possessed the same quiet intensity that had driven Marsha's own career in nursing. As they sat at the kitchen table sharing sandwiches and watching the harbor through the window, Emma asked the question that Marsha had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. "Grandma, why did you really stop nursing? Mom always says you retired early, but she gets weird about it when I ask for details." Marsha's hand stilled on her teacup. This was dangerous territory, the place where her carefully constructed peaceful existence intersected with the complicated truth of her past. But looking at Emma, seeing the pain the girl was carrying, both physical and emotional, Marsha found herself at a crossroads she'd been avoiding for 15 years. "It's complicated, sweetheart," she said finally. "Sometimes doing the right thing and doing the safe thing aren't the same choice." Emma leaned forward, her journalist's instincts inherited from some unknown ancestor clearly engaged. "What do you mean?" Marsha stood and moved to the kitchen window, ostensibly to check on the weather, but really to buy herself time to think. Outside, the fishing boats continued their eternal dance with the tides, and she found herself envying their simple purpose. They went out, they came back, they provided for their families. There were no moral ambiguities in their work, no moments when compassion and protocol collided with explosive force. "There was a patient once," she began, her voice carefully measured. "A young woman, not much older than you are now. She came to the hospital with pain that nobody could explain, symptoms that didn't fit any of the standard diagnoses." She turned back to face Emma, seeing her own younger self reflected in the girl's attentive expression. Sometimes, in medicine, you reach a point where you have to choose between following the rules and following your conscience. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Emma's eyes widened with understanding, not complete understanding. Not yet, but the recognition that she was being offered a piece of a story that had been carefully guarded for years. "What happened?" Emma asked quietly. Marsha returned to her seat, her hands finding the familiar texture of the Afghan. Each stitch represented a choice, a moment of patient creation that had resulted in something both beautiful and functional. Perhaps it was time to begin unraveling another kind of careful construction, the story she'd kept locked away for so long. "That," she said, meeting Emma's eyes with steady resolve, "is a longer conversation. One that might help you understand, not just what happened to me, but maybe what's happening to you." As the afternoon light began to shift toward evening, painting the cottage in shades of gold and amber, both women seemed to recognize that they stood at the threshold of something significant. The past was about to meet the present, and neither of their lives would remain unchanged by the collision. The evening hours brought a different quality to their conversation, a deeper intimacy born of shared vulnerability. As Marsha prepared dinner fresh cod from the local market, roasted vegetables from her small garden, Emma found herself studying her grandmother with new attention. She'd always known Marsha was different from other grandmothers, more serious. Somehow, carrying herself with a professional bearing that even retirement hadn't entirely erased. But she'd never considered what experiences had shaped that bearing, what stories lay behind the careful way Marsha chose her words. "You know," Emma said, watching Marsha move efficiently around the kitchen despite her age, "I never really thought about what your nursing career was like. When I was little, you were just grandma who knew how to fix everything. But you must have seen so much." Marsha paused in her preparation of the fish, her hand stilling on the cutting board. 40 years. "In hospitals," she said quietly, "I saw births and deaths, recoveries and tragedies. I saw the best and worst of human nature, often in the same shift." She resumed her work, but her movements had grown more thoughtful. "The hardest part wasn't the medical challenges, though. It was the politics. The way this system could fail. Patients, especially the most vulnerable ones." Emma shifted in her chair, wincing slightly as her knee protested the movement. The pain had been worse today, probably from the long drive, and she found herself wondering if this was what that other girl had experienced, this constant awareness of something wrong in her body that everyone else dismissed. "Is that why you left?" Emma asked. "The politics?" "Partly." Marsha's answer was carefully neutral, but Emma caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested deeper complexities. Sometimes standing up for what you believe in comes with a price. I wasn't always willing to accept the limitations of what I was allowed to do for my patients. The cottage felt smaller as evening settled around them, the walls seeming to press closer, as if the very structure was leaning in to listen to their conversation. Through the windows, the harbor lights began to twinkle, creating a constellation that mirrored the stars emerging overhead. This was Marsha's favorite time of day, when the boundary between day and night created a liminal space where difficult conversations felt more possible. After dinner, they settled back in the living room. Emma stretched out on the couch with the Afghan draped over her legs. Marsha in her chair with a cup of chamomile tea growing cold in her hands. The fire in the small fireplace crackled softly, casting dancing shadows that seemed to animate the framed photographs lining the mantel images of Emma's childhood. Rebecca's wedding, Marsha's own parents long past. "The patient you mentioned earlier," Emma said, her voice quiet but persistent. "The one with pain nobody could explain. What was her name?" Marsha was quiet for so long that Emma began to wonder if she'd overstepped. But finally, her grandmother's voice emerged from the fire-lit dimness. "Sarah. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, and she was 17 years old when I first met her." The words seemed to cost Marsha something, as if speaking the name aloud broke a seal that had been carefully maintained for decades. She came to the emergency room on a Tuesday night in October, 1983. I remember because the World Series was playing on the waiting room television, and her father kept glancing at the screen. While trying to comfort her, Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze rattling the windows. There was something in her grandmother's voice, a weight that spoke of profound significance. "She was in so much pain," Marsha continued, her eyes fixed on the fire. "Her left knee was swollen, hot to the touch, and she could barely put weight on it. But all the initial tests came back normal. X-rays showed nothing. Blood work was unremarkable. The emergency room doctor sent her home with anti-inflammatories and instructions to follow up with her regular physician if the pain persisted. But it did persist," Emma guessed. "It got worse, much worse. Over the following weeks, I saw Sarah return to the hospital 3 more times. Each visit, she was in more pain, more desperate. And each time, she was sent away with the same dismissive attitude. Growing pains, they called it. Teenage dramatics. One doctor actually suggested that she might be seeking attention from her parents or trying to get out of school responsibilities." Emma's hands tightened on the Afghan. The parallel to her own experience was unmistakable, and she felt a growing sense of recognition that was both validating and terrifying. "I was working the orthopedic floor then," Marsha continued. "It wasn't my job to follow emergency room cases, but something about Sarah stayed with me. Maybe it was the way her mother looked so helpless, or how Sarah herself never complained despite being in obvious agony. She had this dignity about her suffering that reminded me of my own mother during her final illness." The fire popped and settled, sending sparks up the chimney like tiny stars returning to the night sky. Marsha stood and moved to the mantel, her fingers tracing the edge of a photograph that Emma couldn't quite see from her position on the couch. "I started checking on her unofficial visits," Marsha admitted. "When she came in for appointments with Dr. Harrison, he was the head of orthopedics. I would find excuses to be nearby, to observe how she was walking, how she interacted with her parents. What I saw troubled me more each time." "What did you see?" "A girl disappearing into her pain." Sarah had been an active teenager volleyball, hiking with her family, good grades. But I watched her world contract as the weeks passed. She stopped participating in sports, started missing school. Her parents looked increasingly desperate, and Sarah herself began to carry this defeated expression that no 17-year-old should ever have to wear. Marsha returned to her chair, but instead of settling back into it, she perched on the edge as if preparing to spring into action. The posture was familiar to Emma. It was how Marsha always sat when she was deeply engaged with a problem, when her mind was working through complex possibilities. The worst part was how the medical staff began to treat her. I heard the whispers in the break room, the eye rolls when her mother called to schedule another appointment. They'd labeled her as a difficult case, a teen who was manipulating her parents and wasting everyone's time. It was a label that, once applied, became almost impossible to remove. Emma felt a cold recognition settling in her stomach. She'd seen some of those same expressions on the faces of her own doctors. The subtle skepticism when she described her pain, the way they seemed to be looking through her rather than at her. "But you believed her," Emma said, and it wasn't really a question. I did. Maybe because I'd been 17 once, in pain that adults dismissed. Maybe because my training had taught me to look beyond the obvious explanations. Or maybe Marsha's voice grew softer because I recognized something in her that reminded me of why I became a nurse in the first place, to help people when they needed it most, regardless of whether their condition fit neatly into established categories. The cottage seemed to exhale around them, the old boards settling with soft creaks that sounded almost like whispered conversations. Emma found herself thinking about her own recent experiences with doctors, the way their attention seemed to shift when she described symptoms that couldn't be easily quantified or quickly resolved. What happened next? She asked, though part of her was afraid to know. Marsha met her eyes across the flickering firelight, and Emma saw something there that she'd never noticed before, a core of steel that had been tempered by experiences she was only beginning to understand. What happened next, Marsha said quietly, changed everything. So Sarah, for me, for my entire understanding of what it means to advocate for someone who can't advocate for herself, the night brought restless sleep for both women, though for different reasons. Emma tossed and turned on the pull-out bed in Marsha's small guest room, her knee throbbing with a persistence that seemed to mock every position she tried. The pain had intensified as the evening progressed, radiating up her thigh and down her calf in waves that made her breath catch. By 3 a.m, she gave up on sleep entirely and limped to the kitchen for water and whatever over-the-counter pain medication she could find. Marsha heard her granddaughter moving around and appeared in the doorway, her silver hair braided for sleep, wearing a worn cotton nightgown that had seen decades of similar midnight emergencies. Without a word, she moved to the cabinet above the refrigerator and retrieved the heating pad, plugging it in and adjusting it around Emma's knee with practiced efficiency. Worse at night? Marsha asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Emma nodded, tears of frustration threatening at the corners of her eyes. It's like it has its own schedule. During the day, I can almost convince myself it's getting better. But as soon as I try to sleep, the inflammation increases when you're horizontal. Marsha explained, her nursing instincts taking over. Less gravity to help with circulation, and your body's natural anti-inflammatory processes are less active during rest periods. She paused, studying Emma's face in the dim kitchen light. How long has it been doing this? Since the injury. 3 weeks. Emma's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting pain for longer than seemed reasonable. The doctors keep saying it should be better by now, that I must be doing something to aggravate it. But I followed every instruction, done every exercise they suggested. Marsha settled into the chair across from Emma, her expression thoughtful. The similarity to Sarah's case was becoming more apparent with each detail, and she felt the familiar weight of professional concern settling over her shoulders like a mantle she'd thought she'd permanently discarded. Tell me exactly what happened during the injury, Marsha said. Not what the coaches or doctors think happened, but what you experienced. Emma closed her eyes, seeming to retreat into memory. We were doing agility drills. Nothing unusual, just cone work and direction changes. I'd done the same routine probably 100 times. But when I planted my left foot to change direction, it was like something fundamental gave way. Not just my knee, it felt like my whole leg just decided to stop working. Was there a pop? A specific moment of acute pain? That's just it. There wasn't. That's what's been so frustrating about trying to explain it. There was no dramatic moment, no obvious trauma. 1 second I was running normally. The next I was on the ground with this deep, aching pain that felt like it had always been there. Waiting. Marsha leaned forward, her interest clearly engaged. Like it had always been there. Waiting. That's an interesting way to put it. I know it sounds weird, but that's the best way I can describe it. Like my body finally admitted something was wrong that it had been hiding for a long time. The heating pad hummed softly between them, providing a gentle warmth that seemed to ease some of the tension in Emma's face. Outside, the ocean continued its eternal conversation with the shore, waves rolling in and retreating with the kind of patience that only comes from performing the same action for millennia. "Ah," Marsha said carefully, "I want to show you something. Will you be okay here for a moment?" Emma nodded, curious despite her discomfort. Marsha disappeared into her bedroom and returned several minutes later carrying a worn leather journal. Its pages yellowed with age and filled with handwriting in various inks. She set it on the table between them with the reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. "This is my medical journal from 1983, Marsha explained. "I kept detailed notes on cases that puzzled me, patients whose conditions didn't fit standard diagnoses. I stopped keeping it after everything changed." She opened the journal carefully, pages crackling with age, and turned to a section marked with a faded ribbon bookmark. Emma could see her grandmother's neat handwriting covering the pages, interspersed with sketches and what appeared to be medical diagrams. "Here," Marsha said, pointing to an entry dated October 15th, 1983. "Sarah Mitchell, age 17. Initial presentation: severe left knee pain, onset during routine physical activity. Patient describes sensation as awakening of something that was always there." Emma's breath caught. The phrase was almost identical to her own description from moments earlier. Marsha continued reading from her notes. "Patient exhibits classic signs of inflammatory condition, but standard tests negative. Symptoms worsen at night, improve slightly with heat application. Family history notable for autoimmune conditions on maternal side." She looked up at Emma. "What do you know about your family medical history?" "Not much," Emma admitted. "Mom doesn't talk about that stuff, and I never knew my dad's side of the family very well." She paused, a thought occurring to her. "Wait, didn't great-grandmother Helen have some kind of arthritis?" Mom mentioned it once. Marsha's expression sharpened. Helen had rheumatoid arthritis, diagnosed in her 40s. But before that, she spent years being told her joint pain was psychosomatic, that she was imagining symptoms because she was unhappy in her marriage. The heating pad cycled off with a soft click, leaving them in the relative quiet of the cottage at night. Emma stared at the journal, seeing not just her grandmother's neat handwriting, but a pattern that seemed to stretch across generations. Women's pain dismissed, symptoms minimized, suffering attributed to emotional weakness rather than physical illness. "Marsha," Emma said quietly, "what exactly was wrong with Sarah?" Her grandmother turned several pages in the journal, stopping at what appeared to be a more detailed medical assessment. "It took weeks to figure out, and when we finally did, it was almost by accident. Sarah had what's called juvenile idiopathic arthritis, a rare autoimmune condition that typically manifests in childhood but can appear in teenagers. The idiopathic part means we don't know what causes it, which makes it notoriously difficult to diagnose." Emma felt something cold settling in her stomach. Autoimmune condition? The body's immune system begins attacking healthy joint tissue, causing inflammation, pain, and eventually damage if left untreated. Marsha's voice took on the clinical tone of someone explaining a diagnosis. "It's particularly tricky in cases like Sarah's because it can present as a single affected joint rather than the multiple joint involvement we usually expect to see." "But how did you figure it out?" "If all the tests were negative." Marsha closed the journal and leaned back in her chair, her expression growing more complex. "That's where the story becomes complicated. The standard diagnostic protocol wasn't working, and Sarah was getting worse. I started researching on my own time, reading medical journals, consulting with specialists outside our hospital network." "That doesn't sound complicated. That sounds like good nursing." "It was also against hospital policy." Marsha's voice carried a weight that Emma was beginning to recognize, the sound of someone who had made choices with significant consequences. Nurses weren't supposed to conduct independent research or seek outside consultations without physician approval. We were expected to support the attending physician's treatment plan, not question it. Emma shifted in her chair, the heating pad slipping slightly as she leaned forward. But you did it anyway. I did it anyway. I spent my off hours in the medical library, calling specialists at other hospitals, even reaching out to researchers who had published papers on rare arthritis conditions. Marsha's eyes grew distant, as if she was seeing those long-ago nights in the library, surrounded by medical texts and driven by the kind of urgency that comes from watching someone suffer needlessly. I became convinced that Sarah had juvenile arthritis, but convincing Dr. Harrison was another matter entirely. He didn't believe you. He didn't think a nurse had any business making diagnostic suggestions, especially ones that contradicted his clinical judgment. Marsha's tone remained neutral, but Emma caught the underlying frustration that even decades hadn't entirely erased. I presented my research to him, carefully compiled evidence, case studies from similar patients, recommendations for additional testing. He dismissed it all as nursing overreach and ordered me to focus on my assigned duties. The cottage seemed to grow quieter around them, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen to this story that had clearly been held in silence for too long. Emma found herself thinking about her own experiences with medical authority. The way doctors' voices carried automatic weight that somehow made her doubt her own understanding of her body. "What did you do?" Emma asked, though she suspected the answer would explain everything about why her grandmother had left nursing. Marsha opened the journal again, turning to a page near the back where the handwriting was more hurried, less neat. "I made a choice that changed everything. I decided that Sarah's well-being was more important than hospital protocol." She began reading from the journal. November 8, 1983. Patient condition deteriorating despite standard treatment. Family increasingly desperate. Have identified specialist at Boston Children's Hospital who has published extensively on juvenile arthritis. Plan to arrange consultation independent of hospital channels. Emma felt her breath catch. "You went around Dr. Harrison?" "I contacted Dr. Elizabeth Chun at Boston Children's directly, explained Sarah's case, shared my research, and asked if she would be willing to see Sarah as a consulting physician." Marsha's voice grew softer, as if she was still amazed by her own audacity. Dr. Chun agreed to see Sarah on a Saturday, when the hospital's administrative oversight would be minimal. "How did you arrange it?" Surely Sarah's parents had to be involved. They were desperate enough to try anything. I explained the situation to them privately, told them I'd found a specialist who might be able to help, but that the consultation would have to be unofficial. They agreed immediately. Emma stared at her grandmother with new understanding. The woman she'd always known as careful and methodical had once been willing to risk her entire career for a patient she barely knew. What happened when Dr. Chun examined Sarah? Marsha's expression grew both triumphant and rueful. She confirmed the diagnosis within 15 minutes, ordered specific blood tests that our hospital hadn't considered, identified markers that clearly indicated juvenile arthritis, and prescribed a treatment plan that began working within days. "So you were right. I was right. But being right wasn't enough to save my career." Marsha closed the journal with finality. Dr. Harrison found out about the unauthorized consultation. There was a formal investigation, disciplinary hearings, and ultimately, I was given the choice between resignation and termination. Emma felt a surge of anger on behalf of her grandmother's younger self. "That's horrible. You helped a patient who was suffering, and they punished you for it." "The hospital had rules for good reasons," Marsha said, though her tone suggested she didn't entirely believe her own words. "Patient care protocols, chain of command, liability concerns. From their perspective, I had overstepped my authority. and created legal risks. But Sarah got better? Sarah got better. The treatment Dr. Chan prescribed put her arthritis into remission. She was back to playing volleyball within 6 months. Marsha paused, something crossing her face that Emma couldn't quite interpret, though I never found out what happened to her after that. I left nursing shortly after the disciplinary hearing, and I never followed up. Emma reached across the table and covered her grandmother's hand with her own. You saved her life. Maybe. Or maybe I just helped her avoid years of unnecessary suffering. Marsha squeezed Emma's hand gently. The point is, sweetheart, that your symptoms sound remarkably similar to Sarah's. And given your family history, you think I might have the same condition. I think you deserve to have someone take your pain seriously and investigate all the possibilities, not just the convenient ones. Marsha stood and moved to the kitchen window, looking out at the harbor where a few boats showed lights despite the late hour. I think you deserve an advocate who won't stop asking questions just because the first round of tests came back normal. Emma felt something shifting inside her chest. Not quite hope, but something adjacent to it. The possibility that her pain had a name, a cause, a treatment. That she wasn't imagining it or exaggerating it or failing to heal properly from a simple sports injury. What do we do? She asked. Marsha turned back to face her, and Emma saw something in her grandmother's expression that she recognized from childhood. The look Marsha did when she decided to fix something that everyone else had given up on. We do what I should have done 40 years ago, Marsha said quietly. We find out what happened to Sarah, and we ask for her help. The morning light found them still at the kitchen table, surrounded by the remnants of their midnight conversation, empty teacups, the open medical journal, and a shared understanding that had fundamentally altered the landscape between them. Emma had dozed fitfully in her chair for the last hour before dawn, her knee propped on a cushion and wrapped in the heating pad that had become her constant companion. Marsha had remained awake, studying her granddaughter's sleeping face and marveling at how much she resembled Sarah at the same age, not physically, but in that particular way young women carried pain, when they'd learned that expressing it brought skepticism rather than comfort. When Emma stirred, blinking in the pale morning light filtering through salt-stained windows, Marsha was already preparing coffee with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent decades managing on little sleep. The familiar routine of morning preparations, measuring grounds, filling the kettle, setting out cups provided a gentle transition from the intensity of their nighttime revelations. How's the knee this morning? Marsha asked, though Emma's careful movements as she adjusted her position answered the question before words were necessary. Better than last night, but not good. Emma's voice carried the hoarse quality of interrupted. Sleep. The heating pad helped, but it's still so stiff I can barely bend it. She paused, seeming to gather courage for the question that had been forming since their conversation ended. Grandma, are you really going to try to find Sarah? Marsha turned from the coffee preparation to study her granddaughter's face. In the morning light, Emma looked younger than her 16 years. Vulnerability written in the careful way she held herself, and the hope she was trying not to let show too clearly. I think we should try, Marsha said carefully. Though I have to be honest, I have no idea if she'll even remember me, or if she'll be willing to help. It's been 40 years, and our last interaction wasn't exactly under normal circumstances. Emma shifted forward in her chair, wincing slightly as movement jarred her knee. Tell me more about her. What was she like as a person, not just as a patient? Marsha poured coffee for both of them, the rich aroma filling the kitchen with warmth that seemed to push back against the morning chill. She settled across from Emma with her cup, steam rising between them like incense in a confessional. Sarah was remarkable, Marsha began, her voice taking on the tone of someone retrieving carefully preserved memories. Even in pain, even when she was being dismissed by doctor after doctor, she maintained this dignity that impressed everyone who worked with her. She never complained, never demanded attention or special treatment. If anything, she was almost too stoic for her own good. She opened the medical journal again, turning to a page that contained not just clinical notes, but more personal observations written in the margins. I wrote here that she reminded me of my own mother, someone who had learned early that suffering was supposed to be borne quietly, that asking for help was somehow a character flaw. Emma studied the faded photograph that Marsha kept tucked between the journal's pages, a small Polaroid, showing a hospital identification badge with the name Marsha Coleman, RN, and a picture of her grandmother as a young woman. The face in the photo was serious but kind, with the same intelligent eyes that Emma recognized, though surrounded by dark hair instead of silver. "You were so young," Emma observed. 25 when I started at the hospital, 45 when I left. 20 years that felt like a lifetime. Marsha touched the edge of the photograph gently. "I became a nurse because I wanted to help people, to be the advocate for patients who couldn't advocate for themselves. Sarah represented everything I believed nursing should be, putting the patient's needs above institutional convenience." Emma sipped her coffee, feeling the caffeine begin to counteract the fog of her sleepless night. What did she look like? Sarah, I mean. Tall for her age, like you. Long brown hair that she usually wore in a ponytail. She had these green eyes that seemed older than the rest of her, like they'd seen more than any 17-year-old should have to see. Marsha paused, seeming to search for the right words. But what I remember most about her was how she moved even when she was in pain. Very deliberate, very controlled. She never let the pain make her sloppy or careless. "That sounds familiar," Emma said quietly. "I've been doing that too, trying to move normally so people don't think I'm being dramatic. It's a survival strategy that many young women learn early," Marsha acknowledged. "If you show too much pain, you're labeled as hysterical or attention-seeking. If you show too little, people assume you're not really suffering. It's an impossible balance." Emma set down her coffee cup and leaned back in her chair, studying her grandmother's face. "The doctor who dismissed her case, Dr. Harrison, what was he like?" Marsha's expression grew more complex, as if she was trying to be fair to someone who hadn't been fair to her. "Harrison wasn't a bad doctor, exactly. He was competent within his areas of expertise, respected by his colleagues, successful by most measures. But he had blind spots that were typical of his generation and training." She stood and moved to the kitchen window, looking out at the harbor where fishing boats were beginning their morning departure. He believed very strongly in hierarchical medicine, the idea that doctors diagnosed and treated, while nurses followed orders and provided basic care. The concept of collaborative healthcare, where different professionals might contribute insights to diagnosis, was foreign to his understanding of how hospitals should function. So when you brought him research about Sarah's condition, he saw it as insubordination, not collaboration. From his perspective, I was a nurse overstepping my role rather than a healthcare professional contributing to patient care. Marsha's tone remained measured, but Emma could hear the underlying frustration that decades hadn't entirely erased. He also had very traditional views about women in pain. He genuinely believed that teenage girls were more likely to exaggerate symptoms for attention than to suffer from complex medical conditions. Emma felt a familiar anger rising in her chest, the same frustration she'd experienced with her own doctors. The sense that her gender and age had somehow disqualified her from having her pain taken seriously. "That's exactly what I've been dealing with," she said. "Every doctor I've seen has asked if I'm stressed about school, or if there are problems at home, or if I'm having trouble with friends. Like my knee pain is somehow psychosomatic because I'm a teenage girl. Unfortunately, not much has changed. In 40 years, Marsha said, returning to her seat. Medical bias against women, particularly young women, remains a significant problem. Studies show that women's pain is consistently underestimated and undertreated compared to men's. And teenage girls face the additional burden of having their symptoms attributed to emotional causes. Emma absorbed this information with the mixture of validation and frustration that comes from learning that a personal problem is actually a systemic issue. On one hand, it was reassuring to know that her experiences weren't unique or somehow her fault. On the other hand, the scope of the problem felt overwhelming. But Sarah got better, Emma said, seeking reassurance. The treatment worked. The treatment worked beautifully. Within 2 weeks of starting the medication Dr. Chen prescribed, Sarah's inflammation began to decrease. Within a month, she was walking normally. Within 6 months, she was back to playing volleyball. Marsha's voice carried both pride and regret. I got to see the beginning of her recovery, but I never found out what happened after that. Emma leaned forward, her reporter's instincts engaging despite her fatigue. Why didn't you stay in touch? It seems like you'd formed a real connection. Marsha was quiet for a long moment, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup as if seeking warmth from more than just the liquid. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a vulnerability that Emma had rarely heard from her grandmother. I was ashamed, she admitted. After the disciplinary hearing, after losing my job, I felt like I'd failed not just professionally, but personally. I'd broken the rules to help Sarah, and even though she got better, the consequences for me were severe. I was angry and hurt, and I didn't want to be reminded of what that choice had cost me. But helping her was the right thing to do. Ethically, yes. Practically, it destroyed my career and my confidence in the medical system I'd devoted my life to serving. Marsha set down her cup and opened the journal again, turning to one of the final entries. I wrote here, about 3 months after Sarah's recovery began, success feels hollow when it comes at the price of professional suicide. Did I help one patient at the cost of helping hundreds of others, I might have served over the remaining years of my career? Emma felt a pang of understanding that surprised her with its intensity. Her grandmother had made an impossible choice, sacrificing her own future to help someone who was suffering. The nobility of the action was complicated by its consequences, creating a moral ambiguity that had clearly haunted Marsha for decades. Do you regret it? Emma asked quietly. Marsha considered the question seriously, her eyes focused on something beyond the kitchen walls. I regret the way it ended. I regret not fighting harder for the principle behind what I did. I regret letting shame prevent me from maintaining contact with Sarah, from seeing the full result of what we accomplished together. She paused, meeting Emma's eyes directly. But I don't regret helping her. I can't regret that. The conviction in her grandmother's voice stirred something in Emma's chest, a recognition of the kind of courage she hoped she might possess in similar circumstances. It also crystallized her understanding of why finding Sarah had become important, not just for her own medical needs, but for her grandmother's healing. So how do we find her? Emma asked. Sarah Mitchell is probably a pretty common name, and it's been 40 years. She could be anywhere. Could have changed her name if she got married. I've been thinking about that. Marsha stood and moved to a small desk in the corner of the kitchen, pulling out a notepad and pen. I remember some details that might help narrow the search. Her father worked for the phone company. Her mother was a substitute teacher. They lived in Brookline, and Sarah was planning to attend UMass Amherst after graduation. Emma watched her. Grandmother write down the details with the methodical approach she brought to all problems. That's actually quite a bit to go on. And with the internet now, which is where you come in, Marsha said, smiling for the first time since their conversation had begun. I may understand medical research, but navigating modern technology is beyond my capabilities. I still use a flip phone and get nervous when the computer makes unexpected noises. Emma felt a spark of energy despite her exhaustion and pain. Here was something concrete she could contribute, a way to be useful in solving the puzzle that might hold the key to her own healing. "I can definitely help with that," she said. "What else do you remember about her family?" By mid-morning, Emma had transformed Marsha's small kitchen table into a makeshift research center. Her laptop sat open among the coffee cups and medical journals, its screen casting a blue glow that seemed oddly modern against the cottage's weathered wood and faded fabrics. She'd spent the past hour teaching her grandmother the basics of internet searching. Their heads bent together over the keyboard as Emma explained the logic of search engines and the art of refining queries. "So if we search for Sarah Mitchell?" "UMass Amherst, 1984, Emma said, her fingers dancing across the keys. "We might find graduation records or alumni directories." She paused, studying the search results that populated the screen. "Here, look at this. There's a Sarah L. Mitchell listed in the class of 1987 directory for the College of Natural Sciences." Marsha leaned closer, adjusting her reading glasses to focus on the small text. That would be about right for timing. If she graduated high school in 1984 and went straight to college. She stopped, something in her expression shifting. Natural sciences. I remember now she wanted to study biology. She talked about maybe becoming a doctor someday, using her experience as a patient to help other people. Emma felt a flutter of recognition at this detail. There was something poetic about the idea that Sarah might have turned her suffering into a calling to help others, transforming her experience as a dismissed patient into expertise as a healing professional. She clicked on the alumni directory link, hoping for more information. "It's asking for login credentials," Emma reported with disappointment. Alumni directories are usually restricted to people who actually attended the school. "What about other approaches?" Marsha asked. "You mentioned earlier that people have social media profiles now. Right, but Sarah Mitchell is incredibly common. I've already found dozens of women with that name just in Massachusetts." Emma scrolled through a list of Facebook profiles, each thumbnail image representing a potential connection to their past. "We need more specific identifiers. What about her parents' names? Or the high school she attended?" Marsha returned to the notepad where she'd been recording memories, her handwriting neat despite the early hour and emotional intensity of their conversation. Her mother's name was Patricia. I remember because she always introduced herself as Patricia, not Patty. The father was Robert, but everyone called him Bob. Sarah attended Brookline High School. Emma added these details to her search, feeling like a detective assembling clues from a decades-old case. The process was methodical but oddly intimate. Each new piece of information brought them closer to a person who had been absent from Marsha's life for 40 years, but had clearly never been absent from her thoughts. "Here," Emma said suddenly, her voice carrying excitement. "I found a yearbook website that has digitized copies of old high school yearbooks. Let me see if they have Brookline High from 1984. She navigated to the site and typed in the school name and year. After a moment of loading, a scan of the yearbook cover appeared on screen. Brookline High School, class of 1984, emblazoned across a photo of the school's brick facade. "This is incredible," Marsha breathed, staring at the screen with wonder. "I can't believe these things exist online now." Emma clicked through to the individual student photos, scrolling through alphabetically arranged portraits of 18-year-olds frozen in time. When she reached the M's, they both leaned forward instinctively. "There," Marsha said quietly, pointing to a photo near the bottom of the page. Sarah Lynn Mitchell. The image was small and somewhat grainy, but it showed a young woman with the long brown hair and serious expression that Marsha had described. Sarah's yearbook photo captured the same quality that Marsha remembered, a maturity beyond her years, eyes that seemed to hold experiences most teenagers hadn't yet encountered. Emma stared at the photo, feeling a strange connection to this girl. From before she was born, she looked strong, she observed. Even in a yearbook photo, you can see it. She was strong. Stronger than she should have had to be. Marsha touched the screen gently as if she could reach through time to comfort the teenager in the photo. Look, there's a quote under her name. Emma squinted at the small text. The future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams. Eleanor Roosevelt. She looked up at her grandmother. That's actually perfect, isn't it? Considering what she went through and how she overcame it. It is, Marsha agreed, though her voice carried a note of sadness. I hope she got to live those dreams. Emma bookmarked the yearbook page and continued her search, now armed with Sarah's medal. Name and confirmed graduation year. Let me try searching for Sarah Lynn Mitchell with various professional credentials. If she did go into medicine like she planned, the search yielded more promising results. Several professional directories appeared, including state medical boards and hospital staff listings. Emma clicked through them systematically, cross-referencing ages and locations with what they knew about Sarah's background. Wait, Emma said, her voice rising with excitement. Look at this. Massachusetts Board of Medicine has a Dr. Sarah L. Mitchell listed as a licensed physician. Specialty is listed as, she paused, reading carefully, pediatric rheumatology. Marsha's breath caught audibly. Pediatric rheumatology. She specialized in treating children with arthritis and autoimmune conditions, just like what she had, Emma said, the significance not lost on her. She really did turn her experience into her calling. They stared at the screen in silence for a moment, absorbing the implications of this discovery. The girl who had been dismissed and misdiagnosed for months had grown up to become a specialist in the exact condition she'd suffered from. There was a symmetry to it that felt almost too perfect to be coincidental. Emma clicked on the physician profile, hoping for more details. It says she's affiliated with Boston Children's Hospital. That's the same hospital where the doctor who helped her worked, right? Dr. Chun? Yes, Marsha said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah went back to the place where she was finally diagnosed correctly. The profile included a brief biography that made Emma's heart race as she read it aloud. Dr. Sarah Mitchell completed her medical degree at Harvard Medical School and her residency in pediatrics at Boston Children's Hospital. She subsequently completed a fellowship in pediatric rheumatology and has spent the past 15 years developing innovative treatment protocols for children with autoimmune conditions. Dr. Mitchell is particularly interested in improving diagnostic processes for rare conditions that are often overlooked in young patients. She's been doing exactly what you did for her, Emma said, turning to look at her grandmother. Fighting for patients who aren't being heard, making sure kids like she was get proper diagnosis and treatment. Marsha's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I had no idea. All these years, I wondered what happened to her, whether the treatment continued to work, whether she was able to live a normal life. And she became this. Emma continued reading from the profile. It says here she's published extensively on early intervention strategies for juvenile arthritis and has developed new diagnostic criteria that have been adopted nationally. She looked up at Marsha. Grandma, she's not just treating patients. She's changing how doctors approach these conditions. How many kids do you think she's helped over the years? Hundreds. Maybe thousands. Marsha wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. And it all started because you refused to let her suffer in silence. Because you risked your career to get her the help she needed. Emma reached across the table and took her grandmother's hand. Don't you see? Your choice didn't just save one patient. It created a doctor who has been saving patients for decades. The weight of this realization settled over them both. What had seemed like a personal and professional tragedy for Marsha was revealed to have been the catalyst for something much larger. Ripple effect of healing that had touched countless lives over 4 decades. The profile lists her office. Contact information, Emma said gently. Do you want to try calling her? Marsha stared at the screen, her expression cycling through fear, hope, and determination. I don't know what I would say. Hello, Sarah. This is the nurse who got fired for helping you 40 years ago, and I need your help with my granddaughter. How about, hello, Dr. Mitchell. This is Marsha Coleman. You might not remember me, but I was your nurse in 1983 when you were diagnosed with juvenile arthritis. I know this is unusual, but I'm hoping you might be willing to help my granddaughter, who seems to be experiencing very similar symptoms. Emma's suggested script hung in the air between them, simple and direct, but loaded with decades of unspoken history. Marsha considered it carefully, her fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm that suggested internal debate. What if she doesn't remember me? Marsha asked. What if she's moved on completely from that part of her life? Then we'll know. We tried, Emma said practically. But look at what she chose to do with her career. I don't think someone dedicates their life to helping kids with the same condition they had. Just moves on completely. I think that experience shaped everything that came after. Marsha stood and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the harbor where boats continued their daily dance with the tides. The morning had grown bright and clear, with the kind of crisp autumn light that made everything seem possible. There's something else, Emma said quietly. Something I haven't told you about my pain. Marsha turned back to face her granddaughter, noting the shift in Emma's tone. It's not just the knee anymore, Emma continued. Over the past few days, I've started having pain in my other joints too. My wrists, my ankles, and I'm exhausted all the time, even when I sleep well. She paused, gathering courage. I'd been scared to mention it because I thought people would think I was making it up, that I was letting one injury turn into some kind of whole-body complaint. Marsha returned to the table and sat down heavily, her expression grave. Those are classic signs of systemic autoimmune inflammation. If your condition is progressing the way Sarah's did, then I need help sooner rather than later. Much sooner. Marsha picked up her phone, the flip phone that Emma had been gently mocking, and stared at it as if it held the key to their future. Dr. Sarah Mitchell it is. The phone call would have to wait. By noon, Emma's condition had deteriorated noticeably, her morning optimism replaced by a bone-deep fatigue that made even sitting upright feel like a monumental effort. Marsha watched her granddaughter with the trained eye of someone who had spent decades recognizing the subtle signs of systemic illness, the slight tremor in Emma's hands, the way she favored multiple joints now instead of just her knee, the grayish pallor that spoke of a body fighting inflammation on multiple fronts. I think we need to get you some immediate relief, Marsha said, closing the laptop and shifting into the practical mode that had served her well through 4 decades of nursing. Before we contact Dr. Mitchell, let's see what we can do to manage your symptoms. She disappeared into her bedroom and returned with a worn medical textbook, its spine cracked from years of use and pages marked with countless sticky notes and annotations. The book fell open naturally to a section on autoimmune conditions, revealing highlighted passages and handwritten notes in the margins, evidence of the research Marsha had conducted all those years ago when Sarah's case had consumed her thoughts. This is where I learned about juvenile arthritis, Marsha explained, settling the book between them on the kitchen table. I spent weeks reading everything I could find about inflammatory conditions in young people, trying to understand what might be causing Sarah's symptoms. Emma leaned forward to study the pages, noting the careful way her grandmother had marked relevant passages and cross-referenced symptoms. Even 40 years later, the thoroughness of Marsha's research was evident. This wasn't casual reading, but the systematic investigation of someone determined to find answers. Look here, Marsha said, pointing to a highlighted section. Early intervention is crucial with autoimmune arthritis. The longer inflammation goes untreated, the more joint damage can occur. But there are things we can do to provide relief while we're waiting for proper medical evaluation. She stood and moved to her kitchen cabinets, retrieving supplies with the efficiency of someone assembling a field hospital. anti-inflammatory medications, heating pads, elastic bandages, a container of Epsom salts, each item selected with purpose. First, we're going to get you into a warm bath with magnesium salts to help reduce muscle tension and inflammation, Marsha instructed. Then we'll alternate heat and cold therapy on your affected joints. And I'll show you some gentle range of motion exercises that can help maintain flexibility without aggravating the inflammation. As Emma soaked in the therapeutic bath, Marsha called Dr. Mitchell's office. The receptionist who answered was polite, but firm Dr. Mitchell's schedule was completely booked for the next 6 weeks, and she wasn't taking new patients without referrals from primary care physicians. "I understand," Marsha said, her voice taking on the professional tone she'd perfected during her nursing career. "But this is somewhat unusual. I'm a former colleague of Dr. Mitchell's, and I'm calling about a case that has personal significance for both of us. Would it be possible to leave a message asking if she might have a few minutes to speak with me by phone?" The receptionist's tone softened slightly at the mention of a professional connection. "I can certainly pass along a message. What should I tell her this is regarding?" Marsha took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would either open a door that had been closed for 40 years or confirm that some bridges, once burned, could never be rebuilt. "Please tell Dr. Mitchell that Marsha Coleman called. I was her nurse at Boston General in 1983 when she was diagnosed with juvenile arthritis. I have a granddaughter who's experiencing very similar symptoms, and I'm hoping Dr. Mitchell might be willing to provide some guidance." After ending the call, Marsha returned to the bathroom to check on Emma, who was emerging from the bath with visibly improved color and movement. The warm water had clearly provided some relief, though her joints remained stiff and tender. "How do you feel?" Marsha asked, helping Emma wrap herself in a thick towel. "Better," Emma admitted. "Not good, but better. The heat definitely helps." She paused, studying her grandmother's face. "Did you call her?" "I left a message." Whether she'd call back, that's another question entirely. They spent the afternoon working through the gentle exercise routine that Marsha had learned during her research decades earlier. Each movement was designed to maintain joint flexibility while minimizing stress on inflamed tissue, and Emma found herself marveling at her grandmother's retained expertise. "You really know all this from taking care of Sarah?" Emma asked as Marsha guided her through a series of careful stretches. "From taking care of Sarah and from 40 years of nursing," Marsha corrected. "You don't spend that long in healthcare without learning something about managing pain and inflammation. Though, I have to admit, it's different when it's your own family member suffering." As evening approached, Emma settled on the couch with her laptop, determined to continue their research despite her fatigue. "I want to learn more about Dr. Mitchell's work," she said. "If we're going to ask for her help, I should understand what she's accomplished." She pulled up several medical journal articles authored by Dr. Sarah Mitchell, reading abstracts aloud to her grandmother. "Novel diagnostic approaches for juvenile idiopathic arthritis in the emergency department. Patient advocacy in pediatric rheumatology, bridging the gap between symptoms and diagnosis. The hidden epidemic, underdiagnosis of autoimmune conditions in adolescent females." Marsha listened to these titles with growing amazement. She's been writing about exactly what happened to her. The difficulties with diagnosis, the gender bias in medical treatment. "There's more," Emma continued. "From patient to physician, personal experience as a tool for medical advocacy. This one was published just 2 years ago." She clicked on the full article, skimming through the introduction. "Grandma, listen to this." She writes, "My interest in pediatric rheumatology began not in medical school, but at age 17, when I experienced firsthand the devastating impact of delayed diagnosis on a young person's life and future." Emma continued reading. "For months, my symptoms were dismissed as psychosomatic, my pain minimized as typical teenage drama. It was only through the extraordinary advocacy of a nurse who was willing to risk her career to ensure I received proper care that I was finally diagnosed and treated appropriately. Marsha's breath caught. She wrote about me. She wrote about you, Emma confirmed, continuing to read. That nurse, whose name I have protected for professional reasons, demonstrated that sometimes the most important medical intervention is simply believing a patient and refusing to accept inadequate care as acceptable. Her willingness to challenge authority on behalf of someone who couldn't advocate for herself changed not only my life, but my understanding of what healthcare should be. The cottage grew quiet except for the sound of waves against the shore and the soft crackling of the fire Marsha had built earlier. Both women absorbed the significance of these words, evidence that their connection had shaped not just Sarah's recovery, but her entire professional philosophy. "She's been thinking about you all these years," Emma said softly. "About what you did for her." "And I've been thinking about her," Marsha replied, wondering if I made the right choice, if the cost was worth it. But reading this, seeing what she's accomplished, the cost was worth it, Emma said with certainty. "Look at all the patients she's helped because of what you taught her about advocacy." Emma clicked through more of Dr. Mitchell's published work, finding article after article focused on improving care for young patients with autoimmune conditions. Her research had contributed to new diagnostic guidelines. Her advocacy had influenced hospital policies, and her patient care philosophy had trained a generation of medical residents. "There's something else," Emma said, pulling up Dr. Mitchell's biography on the Boston Children's Hospital website. It says here that she established the Sarah Mitchell Center for Pediatric Autoimmune Disorders 5 years ago. The center's mission statement includes ensuring that no child's pain is dismissed or minimized due to age, gender, or perceived credibility. Marsha shook her head in wonder. She named a medical center after herself? "No," Emma said, reading more carefully. "It says here that the center was named in honor of Dr. Mitchell by her colleagues and patients' families, recognizing her contributions to pediatric rheumatology and patient advocacy." She looked up at her grandmother. "But I think there's more to it than that. I think she chose to keep her name as Mitchell, even after marriage, if she got married, because of what that name represents to her patients. The girl who was dismissed and then fought to make sure other kids wouldn't be." "Exactly." Emma closed the laptop and leaned back against the couch cushions. "Grandma, when she calls back, and I think she will call back, you need to understand that you're not just asking for help from the patient you saved 40 years ago. You're asking for help from someone who has spent her entire career trying to be the kind of advocate for others that you were for her." Marsha nodded, feeling the weight of this perspective settle over her. The shy, suffering teenager she remembered had grown into a medical leader whose life's work was built on a foundation of their brief but transformative relationship. As if summoned by their conversation, the phone rang. Marsha's flip phone, sitting on the kitchen counter, emitted its old-fashioned trill with startling loudness in the quiet cottage. Both women froze, looking at the device as if it were a portal to the past. "Do you think?" Emma began. "Only one way to find out," Marsha said, moving to answer the call with hands that trembled slightly despite her outward composure. She flipped the phone open and spoke with carefully controlled professionalism. "Hello, this is Marsha Coleman. Miss Coleman?" The voice on the other end was warm, confident, with a slight accent that Marsha didn't remember from 40 years earlier. "This is Dr. Sarah Mitchell. I got your message, and I have to tell you, I never thought I'd have the chance to talk to you again." Marsha's hand tightened on the phone. 40 years of carefully maintained composure threatening to crumble at the sound of that familiar voice, now deepened by age and professional authority, but still carrying the same gentle cadence she remembered from those long-ago hospital conversations. "Sarah," she said, her voice barely steady, "I wasn't sure you'd remember me. Remember you?" Dr. Mitchell's laugh carried genuine warmth. "Miss Coleman, you changed my life. I've thought about you countless times over the years, wondered what happened to you after everything that followed my diagnosis." Anna watched her grandmother's face cycle through emotions: relief, joy, regret, and something that looked remarkably like the expression she'd worn when looking at Sarah's yearbook photo that morning. Marsha gestured for Emma to come closer, and they huddled around the small phone together. "I heard about the disciplinary action," Dr. Mitchell continued, her voice growing more serious. "Dr. Chun told me what you'd risk to arrange my consultation with her. I tried to contact you afterward to thank you properly, but the hospital said you were no longer employed there." "I left nursing," Marsha said simply. "After the hearing, it seemed like the right time to pursue other options." There was a pause that stretched long enough for both women to acknowledge the inadequacy of euphemisms. They both knew that Marsha hadn't left nursing. Nursing had left her in the form of a forced resignation that had ended a career built on compassion and expertise. "I'm sorry," Dr. Mitchell said quietly. "I've carried guilt about that for 40 years. You lost your job because you helped me." "I lost my job because I broke the rules," Marsha corrected, though her tone was gentle. "The fact that breaking the rules was the right thing to do doesn't change the professional consequences I faced." Emma found herself holding her breath, witnessing a conversation that bridged 4 decades of separation and unresolved emotion. She could see the weight both women had been carrying: Marsha's regret about the cost of her advocacy, Sarah's guilt about being the beneficiary of that sacrifice. "Your message mentioned your granddaughter," Dr. Mitchell said, steering the conversation toward the present. "You said she's experiencing similar symptoms?" Marsha looked at Emma, who nodded encouragingly. "Yes, Emma is 16, and she's been dealing with joint pain that started as what appeared to be a sports injury, but has become systemic. Multiple doctors have dismissed her symptoms, and I'm seeing patterns that remind me very much of your case." "Tell me about her symptoms, Doctor," Mitchell said, her voice shifting into professional mode. "And please, put me on speaker so I can talk to Emma directly." Marsha fumbled with the flip phone's speaker function until Emma gently took the device and activated the feature with the ease of someone who had grown up with technology. "Hello, Dr. Mitchell," Emma said, her voice carrying a mixture of nervousness and hope. "Thank you for calling back." "Hello, Emma. Before we talk about your symptoms, I want you to know that your grandmother is one of the most remarkable advocates I've ever encountered. What she did for me required extraordinary courage and conviction." Emma glanced at Marsha, seeing her grandmother's cheeks flush with a combination of pride and embarrassment. "I'm starting to understand that," Emma said. "She told me about your case, and I've been reading your published work today. It's incredible what you've accomplished." "Much of what I've accomplished was built on a foundation your grandmother provided," Dr. Mitchell said matter-of-factly. "But let's focus on you. Walk me through your symptoms from the beginning." Emma recounted her experience in detail: the initial knee injury during soccer practice, the persistent pain that defied normal healing timelines, the gradual spread to other joints, the nighttime intensification of symptoms, the fatigue that seemed disproportionate to her activity level. Dr. Mitchell listened without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated both her expertise and her ability to hear what Emma was really describing. "The doctors you've seen," Dr. Mitchell said when Emma finished. "What tests have they run?" "Basic X-rays, blood work for infection markers, physical therapy evaluation. They keep saying everything looks normal and that I should be healing by now, but they haven't tested for autoimmune markers. ESR, CRP, ANA, RF. Emma looked at Marsha, who shook her head. "No, nothing like that. They've been treating it as a straightforward sports injury." Dr. Mitchell was quiet for a moment, and Emma could almost hear her thinking through the differential diagnosis. Emma, what you're describing sounds very familiar to me, not just because of my own experience, but because I see similar presentations regularly in my practice. The pattern of initial injury followed by systemic symptoms is actually quite common with autoimmune arthritis. So you think it might be the same condition you had? Emma asked. It's certainly possible. Juvenile idiopathic arthritis can present in various ways, and what's called post-traumatic onset is more common than most general physicians realize. Sometimes a minor injury or physical stress can trigger the immune system in someone who's genetically predisposed to autoimmune conditions. Marsha leaned closer to the phone. Sarah, Emma mentioned that her great-grandmother had rheumatoid arthritis. Is there a genetic component we should be considering? Absolutely. Family history of autoimmune conditions is one of the strongest risk factors for developing similar conditions. The fact that Emma's symptoms began with what appeared to be trauma, but have progressed to systemic inflammation despite normal imaging, that's a classic presentation pattern. Emma felt something loosening in her chest, not quite relief, but the validation that comes from having someone with expertise take her symptoms seriously and place them in a medical context that made sense. What would you recommend? Marsha asked. Ideally, I'd like to see Emma in person for a comprehensive evaluation, but I know that's complicated. I'm in Boston. My schedule is packed, and getting insurance approval for out-of-state specialty consults can take weeks. Dr. Mitchell paused, seeming to consider options. However, given the history between us, and given what I see as the urgency of Emma's situation, I'm willing to make some accommodations. Emma exchanged glances with her grandmother, both sensing that something significant was being offered. What kind of accommodations? Marsha asked carefully. I have a cancellation this Saturday morning, a patient whose family had to reschedule due to a family emergency. I could see Emma then as a consultation rather than a formal patient visit, which would allow us to bypass some of the insurance and referral complications. Dr. Mitchell's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to finding solutions within complex medical systems. It would still require payment, but we could discuss that separately. Dr. Mitchell, Emma said quickly, I don't want you to get in trouble for helping me the way Grandma got in trouble for helping you. The laugh that came through the phone was warm and rueful. Emma, one of the advantages of being a department head in a major medical center is that I have considerably more autonomy than your grandmother had as a floor nurse 40 years ago. I can arrange consultations with patients who need them, especially when there's a compelling medical indication. Which there is, Marsha added. Which there definitely is. Emma's symptom progression suggests that we're looking at an active inflammatory process that needs evaluation sooner rather than later. Early intervention makes an enormous difference in long-term outcomes with autoimmune arthritis. Emma felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, not from pain this time, but from the overwhelming relief of being believed, of having her symptoms taken seriously by someone with the expertise to actually help. There's one more thing, Dr. Mitchell said, her voice taking on a more personal tone. Ms. Coleman, Marsha, I've wanted to thank you properly for 40 years. This feels like an opportunity to begin repaying a debt I've never been able to address. You don't owe me anything, Marsha said quickly. What you've done with your career, the patients you've helped, I owe you everything. Dr. Mitchell interrupted gently. My diagnosis, my treatment, my recovery, my medical career, my life's work, all of it traces back to your willingness to advocate for me when no one else would. Helping Emma isn't repaying a debt. It's continuing a tradition of advocacy that you started. The cottage grew quiet except for the sound of the ocean and the soft hum of the phone line connecting them across the decades. Emma watched her grandmother's face, seeing emotions there that she'd never witnessed before, a complex mixture of vindication, gratitude, and something that looked like the lifting of a burden that had been carried for far too long. Saturday morning, Marsha said finally. We'll be there. Excellent. I'll have my office send you the details. And Emma? Dr. Mitchell's voice addressed her directly. I want you to know that you're going to be okay. Whatever this turns out to be, we're going to figure it out and get you the treatment you need. After they ended the call, Emma and Marsha sat in the quiet cottage kitchen, both processing what had just occurred. The reconnection they'd hoped for had not only happened, but it opened the door to medical care that might provide answers Emma had been seeking for weeks. She's going to help me, Emma said, the words carrying wonder as if she couldn't quite believe it. She's going to help us both, Marsha corrected, in ways I don't think either of us fully understands yet. Emma looked at her grandmother with new understanding. You really did save her life, didn't you? And now she's going to save mine. Marsha considered this, her expression thoughtful. I think, she said slowly, that maybe we're all going to save each other. The 3 days between Dr. Mitchell's phone call and the scheduled appointment passed with agonizing slowness for Emma, whose symptoms continued to worsen despite Marsha's careful ministrations. By Friday evening, she was running a low grade fever and experiencing stiffness in joints she'd never paid attention to before her fingers. Her jaw, even her ribs ached when she breathed deeply. Marsha watched these developments with growing concern, her professional instincts telling her that Emma's condition was progressing more rapidly than Sarah's had 40 years earlier. It was while helping Emma prepare for bed that Marsha made a discovery that would change everything she thought she understood about the past. As she was organizing the medication schedule they'd established to manage Emma's symptoms, she decided to retrieve some additional supplies from the storage closet in her bedroom, the same closet where she'd found the medical journal days earlier, tucked behind a box of old nursing textbooks. Marsha's fingers encountered something she'd forgotten existed, a manila envelope, yellowed with age and marked with her own handwriting, Sarah Mitchell personal items. Her heart began racing as she carried the envelope to the kitchen table, where Emma was half-heartedly attempting to eat dinner despite the jaw pain that made chewing difficult. What's that? Emma asked, noting her grandmother's pale expression. I'm not sure, Marsha admitted, though that wasn't entirely true. She had a vague memory of receiving personal items from Sarah's family after her resignation from the hospital, but the pain of that period had been so intense that she'd packed everything away. Without examining it properly, she opened the envelope. Carefully, its contents spilling onto the kitchen table like artifacts from an archaeological dig. There were several handwritten letters, a small photograph, and what appeared to be a folded piece of paper that looked like it might be some kind of official document. Emma leaned forward despite her discomfort, curiosity overriding her pain. Those are from Sarah? Marsha picked up the first letter, noting the careful teenage handwriting and the date, November 1983. Dear Nurse Coleman, it began. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I needed to write to tell you how much your help is meant to me and my family. As Marsha read silently, Emma watched her grandmother's expression shift from curiosity to surprise to something approaching shock. What does it say? Emma prompted. Marsha cleared her throat and began reading aloud. The medicine Dr. Chan prescribed is working better than anyone dared to hope. The pain in my knee is almost completely gone, and I can walk normally again. But more important than the physical healing is what you taught me about standing up for myself and not accepting inadequate care just because I'm young and female. She paused, looking up at Emma. I never saw this. I left the hospital before. It was delivered to me. Emma gestured for her to continue, and Marsha returned to the letter. I've decided that I want to become a doctor, partly because of what I learned from watching you advocate for me. I want to be the kind of physician who listens to patients the way you listen to me, and who isn't afraid to challenge the system when patients aren't getting the care they need. That's beautiful, Emma said softly. She was already planning to become the doctor she became, but Marsha's attention had moved to the second letter, dated December 1983, and her expression grew more troubled as she read. "This one is different," she said. "Listen to this. Dear Nurse Coleman, I've been trying to reach you at the hospital, but they say you're no longer working there. I heard from Dr. Chen that there was trouble because of my case, and I'm worried that you got in trouble for helping me. Please contact me if you get this letter. I need to tell you something important." Emma frowned. Something important? What do you think she meant? Marsha set down the second letter and picked up the third, her hands trembling slightly. This one was dated January 1984, and the handwriting looked more urgent, less carefully formed. "Nurse Coleman," Marsha read. "I don't know how else to reach you. I've called the hospital dozens of times, but they won't give me any information about how to contact you. I know you lost your job because of me, and there's something you need to know about why that happened. It wasn't just Dr. Harrison who complained about what you did. Please call me." The kitchen grew very quiet except for the familiar sound of waves against the shore. Emma stared at her grandmother, who had gone pale while reading the letter. "What does that mean?" Emma asked. "It wasn't just Dr. Harrison?" Marsha set down the letter with hands that were no longer steady. "I don't know. The disciplinary hearing focused on my violation of protocol, my unauthorized consultation with Dr. Chen. Dr. Harrison filed the formal complaint, and that's what I was told led to my resignation." She reached for the folded document in the envelope, though something in her expression suggested she was afraid of what it might contain. As she unfolded it, Emma could see it was some kind of official hospital document, though the text was too small for her to read from her position. Marsha's face went from pale to ashen as she scanned the document. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Grandma, what is it?" With shaking hands, Marsha passed the document to Emma. It was a copy of a formal complaint filed with the hospital's administration, but the signature at the bottom wasn't Dr. Harrison's. It was someone named Dr. Patricia Williams. Chief of Staff. Emma read the complaint aloud. "Nurse Coleman's actions in arranging unauthorized consultation for patient Sarah Mitchell represent a serious breach of protocol that undermines physician authority and creates liability risks for the institution. However, of greater concern are allegations that Nurse Coleman may have accessed confidential patient information inappropriately and shared medical details outside proper channels." Emma looked up at her grandmother in confusion. "The bats? Now what happened, is it? You didn't inappropriately access anything." "No," Marsha said firmly. "Everything I did was within my scope of practice. I observed Sarah during her visits, noted her symptoms, and researched possible diagnoses. I shared relevant medical information with Dr. Chun, only with the family's consent and for the purpose of obtaining proper care." Emma continued reading. "Additional concerns have been raised by nursing staff about Nurse Coleman's increasingly confrontational attitude toward physician decisions and her apparent belief that she is qualified to make diagnostic determinations." "Nursing staff?" Emma asked. "Other nurses complained about you?" Marsha sank into her chair, the weight of this revelation settling over her like a heavy blanket. "I had no idea. The hearing only addressed the unauthorized consultation. No one mentioned these other allegations, and I was never given the opportunity to respond to them." Emma picked up the photograph that had been in the envelope, a small snapshot that showed a much younger Marsha in her nursing uniform, standing with several other nurses in what appeared to be a hospital break room. Everyone was smiling, but as Emma studied the faces, she noticed something troubling about the body language. While Marsha stood in the center of the group, the other nurses seemed to maintain a subtle distance from her, their smiles not quite reaching their eyes. "Who are these people?" Emma asked, showing the photo to her grandmother. Marsha studied the image with growing recognition and dismay. "My colleagues from the orthopedic unit. This was taken at the Christmas party in 1983, just a few weeks before." She stopped, understanding beginning to dawn on her face. Before Sarah's consultation with Dr. Chun, Emma finished. Grandma, do you think some of your colleagues were resentful of how much attention you were giving to Sarah's case? It's possible, Marsha admitted reluctantly. I did spend a lot of off-duty time researching her condition, and I may have been intense about advocating for her. Some of the other nurses might have felt that I was overstepping my role or making them look bad by comparison. Emma felt anger rising in her chest on behalf of her grandmother's younger self. So they sabotaged your career? They made up allegations to get you fired? I don't know if they made anything up, Marsha said carefully. But it's clear that there was more opposition to what I did than I realized at the time. I thought I was fighting one battle against Dr. Harrison's dismissive attitude towards Sarah's symptoms, but apparently I was fighting on multiple fronts. The phone message slip that Emma had noticed in the envelope suddenly took on new significance. It was dated February 1984, 2 months after Marsha's resignation, and contained a phone number with Sarah Mitchell Urgent written in block letters. She kept trying to reach you, Emma said, holding up the message slip. For months after you left the hospital, she was trying to tell you what really happened. Marsha stared at the message slip as if it were evidence of a crime. I never got this. I'd changed my phone number after leaving the hospital because I couldn't handle the sympathy calls from former colleagues. She paused, her voice growing bitter. Apparently, some of that sympathy was less sincere than I thought. Emma gathered all the papers together. Studying them as if they were pieces of a puzzle that was finally revealing its complete picture. Don't you see what this means? She asked. You didn't just lose your job because you helped Sarah. You lost your job because other people felt threatened by your competence and dedication. They used your advocacy as an excuse to get rid of someone who was making them look bad. The revelation hung in the air between them, recontextualizing 40 years of guilt and self-doubt. Marsha had spent decades believing that her choice to help Sarah had been professionally reckless, that she brought her career downfall on herself through poor judgment. But these letters and documents suggested a different story, one in which professional jealousy and institutional politics had conspired to punish excellence rather than encourage it. We have to tell Dr. Mitchell about this, Emma said. When we see her tomorrow, we need to show her these letters. She needs to know that she's been carrying guilt about something that wasn't her fault. Marsha nodded slowly, though her expression remained troubled. But that means admitting that I never got her messages, that I let her think I didn't want to hear from her when she was trying to help me understand what had really happened. It means admitting that you were both victims of a system that punished you for doing the right thing, Emma corrected. And it means that tomorrow's appointment isn't just about my medical care. It's about finally telling each other the truth about what happened 40 years ago. As they prepared for bed, both women carried the weight of these new revelations. The story they'd thought they understood, of professional sacrifice leading to personal consequence, had revealed additional layers of complexity and injustice. But there was also something liberating about finally understanding the full scope of what had occurred, even if that understanding came 4 decades too late. Emma, Marsha said as they turned off the kitchen lights, tomorrow is going to be about more than just your diagnosis, isn't it? Yes, Emma replied. I think tomorrow is about healing more than just my joints. The drive to Boston Children's Hospital on Saturday morning felt like a pilgrimage through time. Emma sat in the passenger seat of Marsha's old Subaru. The manila envelope of letters balanced carefully on her lap alongside a folder containing her recent medical records, the sparse collection of X-rays and blood tests that had failed to provide answers. The morning was crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn light that made the world seem full of possibilities. Though both women carried the weight of anticipation that made conversation difficult, Emma's condition had stabilized somewhat overnight, though Marsha suspected this was due more to the anti-inflammatory regimen they'd established than to any actual improvement in the underlying condition. The fever had broken, but the joint stiffness remained pronounced, and Emma moved with the careful precision of someone constantly aware of her body's limitations. "Are you nervous?" Emma asked as they navigated the increasingly dense Boston traffic. "Terrified," Marsha admitted, her hands gripping the steering wheel with more force than the driving conditions required. "I'm about to see someone I haven't spoken to in 40 years, under circumstances that are going to require us both to confront some very difficult truths." Emma shifted in her seat, trying to find a position that didn't aggravate the stiffness in her spine. "Do you think she'll be angry when she finds out you never got her letters?" "I think she'll be hurt," Marsha said thoughtfully. Sarah was always more inclined toward hurt than anger. "But I also think she'll understand that the system failed both of us in ways that we're only now beginning to comprehend." The hospital complex loomed ahead of them, a sprawling collection of modern buildings that spoke of cutting-edge medical care and institutional authority. Emma found herself thinking about her grandmother's experience 40 years earlier, when medical hierarchies were even more rigid and questioning authority carried greater professional risks. "What was Dr. Chen like?" Emma asked as they searched for parking. "The doctor who actually diagnosed Sarah." "Brilliant and fearless," Marsha replied without hesitation. She was one of the few physicians I'd encountered who treated nurses as colleagues rather than assistants. When I called her about Sarah's case, she listened to my concerns as if they came from another doctor, not someone she considered professionally inferior. They found a parking space in the visitor garage, and as they walked toward the hospital entrance, Emma noticed her grandmother's posture changing. The casual demeanor of their coastal cottage life was replaced by something more professional, more formal, as if Marsha was unconsciously preparing to inhabit her former identity as a nurse. The hospital lobby was bustling with the controlled chaos of a major medical center on a busy Saturday morning. Families clustered around information desks. Medical residents hurried between floors with purposeful urgency, and the inevitable symphony of paging systems provided a constant backdrop of electronic communication. Emma found the environment overwhelming, but she noticed that Marsha moved through it with the confidence of someone returning to familiar territory. At the information desk, they were directed to the rheumatology department on the 7th floor. The elevator ride was conducted in silence, both women lost in their own thoughts about what the next few hours might reveal. Emma clutched the manila envelope more tightly, feeling the weight of 40 years of undelivered truth. The rheumatology department was quieter than the main hospital, with the subdued atmosphere of a place where chronic conditions were managed rather than acute crises resolved. The waiting area was designed with comfort and mind-soft lighting, cushioned chairs arranged to accommodate people with mobility limitations, and artwork that managed to be both cheerful and calming. Emma approached the reception desk while Marsha hung back slightly, as if she needed a moment to gather courage for what was about to unfold. "We're here for a consultation with Dr. Mitchell," Emma said to the receptionist. "Emma Coleman, 10 o'clock appointment." The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and efficient manner, checked her computer screen. "Yes, I have you here. Dr. Mitchell is running just a few minutes behind schedule, but she asked me to let you know that she's cleared her entire morning for your consultation." She paused, looking up at Emma with curiosity. "She also mentioned that you'd be accompanied by a family member who has a professional connection to her. That must be my grandmother," Emma said, gesturing toward Marsha, who had approached the desk with visible apprehension. "Marsha Coleman." The receptionist's expression shifted to one of recognition and respect. "Ms. Coleman, Dr. Mitchell spoke very highly of you yesterday. She's quite excited about this reunion, though I understand there are some medical concerns to address as well." Marsha managed a small smile. "It's been a very long time since we've seen each other." They were directed to a consultation room that was larger and more comfortable than the typical examination rooms. Emma had become accustomed to during her recent medical odyssey. 2 comfortable chairs faced a desk equipped with a computer and what appeared to be sophisticated diagnostic equipment. The walls were lined with medical texts and journals, but also with children's artwork and thank you cards from patients, evidence of the human connections that defined Dr. Mitchell's practice. Emma settled into one of the chairs while Marsha remained standing, too nervous to sit. "What if she's completely different?" Marsha asked. "What if 40 years of success and professional achievement have changed her into someone I don't recognize?" Before Emma could respond, there was a gentle knock on the door, followed by a voice that was both familiar and strange. "Miss Coleman?" "Emma, may I come in?" "Yes," Emma called out, her own voice tight with anticipation. The door opened, and Dr. Sarah Mitchell entered the room with the confident bearing of someone comfortable in her professional environment. Emma's first impression was of someone who had grown into her authority gracefully tall and elegant. With graying brown hair pulled back in a neat bun and intelligent eyes behind stylish glasses. She wore a white coat over professional attire, but her manner was warm rather than clinical. But it was Marsha's reaction that captured Emma's attention. Her grandmother's face cycled through a series of emotions: recognition, wonder, joy, and something that looked remarkably like relief. Whatever fears she'd harbored about Sarah being changed beyond recognition were clearly unfounded. "Sarah," Marsha said softly, and in that single word, Emma heard 40 years of wondering and worry finally coming to rest. Dr. Mitchell's professional composure as she looked at Marsha, and for a moment, Emma could see the 17-year-old girl who had been grateful for an advocate's courage. "Marsha," Dr. Mitchell said, her voice carrying equal measures of joy and regret. You look wonderful." The 2 women stood facing each other across 4 decades of separation, each clearly wanting to bridge the gap, but uncertain about how to begin. Emma realized that her role in this moment was not just as a patient seeking medical care, but as a catalyst for a reunion that needed to happen for both women's healing. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice," Emma said, breaking the emotional tension with practical words. "And thank you for making time to see Grandma again." Dr. Mitchell moved further into the room, her professional training helping her navigate the complex emotions of the moment. "Emma, I'm looking forward to discussing your case in detail. But first," she turned to Marsha, her expression growing more personal. "I need to say something I should have said 40 years ago. What you did for me, the risk you took, the sacrifice you made, it changed everything about my life. I became a doctor because of your example, and I've tried to live up to the standard of advocacy you set." Marsha's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for decades. "Sarah, I need to tell you something too. Something I just discovered a few days ago." She looked at Emma, who held up the manila envelope. "We found letters," Emma explained, understanding her grandmother's emotional state. "Letters you sent to Grandma after her resignation, letters she never received." Dr. Mitchell's expression shifted to one of surprise and concern. "You never got my letters?" "I never got your letters," Marsha confirmed. "I changed my contact information after leaving the hospital, and I think the administration prevented them from reaching me. But Emma found them a few days ago, along with some other documents that have helped us understand what really happened." Dr. Mitchell gestured for both women to sit, her medical training taking over as she recognized that this conversation required careful handling. "What kind of documents?" Emma opened the manila envelope and spread its contents on the small table beside her chair. "Complaints filed against Grandma by other nursing staff. Evidence that her firing wasn't just about helping you, but about professional jealousy and institutional politics." Dr. Mitchell leaned forward to examine the papers, her expression growing increasingly troubled as she read. "Oh, Marsha," she said quietly, "I tried so hard to reach you because I'd learned some of this. A few months after my diagnosis, I heard Rumors that other nurses had complained about your involvement in my case. I wanted you to know that the official story wasn't the whole truth. Marsha's voice was barely audible. You tried to warn me? I tried to support you. I wanted to testify on your behalf, to explain that everything you did was appropriate and necessary. But I couldn't find you, and when I contacted the hospital, they said the matter was closed and that you'd chosen to resign. Emma watched her grandmother absorb this information, seeing the weight of 40 years of misplaced guilt beginning to lift from her shoulders. The story she told herself about professional recklessness was being replaced by a more complex truth about institutional failure and personal courage. There's something else, Dr. Mitchell continued, her voice taking on the authority of someone who had spent decades navigating medical politics. What happened to you was wrong, professionally and ethically. You were punished for excellent nursing, care, and patient advocacy. The fact that it took place within a dysfunctional system doesn't diminish the value of what you did. She stood and moved to her desk, pulling out what appeared to be a formal document. I've been thinking about this conversation since you called, and I've prepared something I should have written 40 years ago. Emma looked at the document, recognizing it as some kind of official letterhead. What is it? A formal commendation for Marsha's nursing care during my case, Dr. Mitchell explained. Written by someone who is now in a position to speak with medical authority about the quality of care I received. It documents the professional excellence and patient advocacy that led to my diagnosis and recovery. She handed the letter to Marsha, who read it with growing amazement. But why? Because the medical record should reflect the truth about what happened, Dr. Mitchell said firmly. Because excellent nursing care deserves recognition, even when that recognition comes decades late. And because I have grandchildren now myself, and I want them to know that their grandmother was helped by one of the finest nurses who ever practiced. Emma felt tears starting in her own eyes as she watched her grandmother read the formal recognition she'd been denied for 40 years. But beyond the personal satisfaction of vindication, she sensed that something larger was being healed, a breach between past and present, between sacrifice and recognition, between two women whose lives had been shaped by a single act of courage. Now, Dr. Mitchell said, her voice brightening as she turned toward Emma, let's talk about getting you the same kind of proper medical care that your grandmother made sure I received. Dr. Mitchell's examination of Emma was unlike anything the teenager had experienced during her frustrating weeks of medical appointments. Where other physicians had approached her case with skepticism barely concealed behind professional courtesy, Dr. Mitchell brought both expertise and genuine empathy to every aspect of the evaluation. I want you to tell me about your pain in your own words, Dr. Mitchell began, settling across from Emma with a notepad that she would actually use rather than the perfunctory gesture Emma had grown accustomed to. Not what you think I want to hear, not what other doctors have told you it should feel like, but exactly what you experience. Emma glanced at her grandmother, who nodded encouragingly from her position in the corner chair. The formal commendation letter lay folded in Marsha's lap, a tangible symbol of validation that seemed to have restored some of her professional confidence. It feels angry, Emma said, surprising herself with the word choice. Like my body is fighting itself. The pain isn't just in one place, it moves around, but it's always there. Sometimes it's sharp and sudden, like someone stabbing me with hot needles. Other times it's this deep ache that makes me feel like my bones are too big for my skin. Dr. Mitchell wrote this down verbatim, her expression serious but not dismissive. That's an excellent description of inflammatory pain. Now, let me examine your joints, but I want you to tell me immediately if anything I do causes discomfort. The physical examination was thorough but gentle, with Dr. Mitchell explaining each step and paying attention to Emma's responses in a way that made her feel like a partner in the diagnostic process, rather than a subject to be evaluated. She tested range of motion in every major joint, palpated for swelling and heat, and performed several specific maneuvers that Emma recognized from her medical research as tests for autoimmune conditions. "Your inflammatory markers are definitely elevated," Dr. Mitchell said, reviewing the blood work results that had just come back from the hospital's weekend lab. "ESR is significantly high, CRP is elevated, and ura-NA is positive with a speckled pattern that's consistent with autoimmune activity." Marsha leaned forward in her chair. "The same pattern Sarah showed?" "Very similar," Dr. Mitchell confirmed. "But Emma's case appears to be progressing more rapidly than mine did. Her symptom onset and systemic involvement suggest a more aggressive autoimmune response, which makes early intervention even more critical." Emma felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Having a medical explanation for her symptoms was validating, but the serious tone in Dr. Mitchell's voice suggested that her condition required immediate attention. "What does that mean for treatment?" Emma asked. Dr. Mitchell turned to her computer and began pulling up what appeared to be treatment protocols and medication information. "It means we need to start you on disease-modifying anti-rheumatic drugs, DMARDs, to control the autoimmune response and prevent joint damage. The specific medications have improved dramatically since I was treated 40 years ago." She printed out several pages of information and handed them to Emma. "These are the current first-line treatments for juvenile idiopathic arthritis. We'll start with methotrexate, which is very effective at controlling inflammation and has an excellent safety profile when properly monitored." Emma scanned the medication information, noting the detailed list of potential side effects and monitoring requirements. "Is this what you took when you were my age?" "I took an earlier generation of similar medications, but the current treatments are much more targeted and effective," Dr. Mitchell explained. "What I took helped me achieve remission, but it required more frequent adjustments and had more side effects. You're fortunate to be diagnosed in an era when we have better options." Marsha's voice carried a note of concern as she asked, "How quickly can Emma expect to see improvement?" "Most patients begin experiencing reduced pain and stiffness within 4 to 6 weeks of starting treatment," Dr. Mitchell replied. "Full response can take 3 to 6 months, but the important thing is that we're intervening early enough to prevent permanent joint damage." She turned back to Emma with an expression that was both professional and personal. "I want you to understand something important. The frustration you've experienced with other doctors being dismissed, having your symptoms minimized, that's not uncommon for young women with autoimmune conditions. But that doesn't make it acceptable." Emma felt tears threatening as someone with medical authority finally acknowledged what she'd been experiencing. "I started to think I was imagining it, or that I was weak for not being able to handle normal pain levels." "You weren't imagining anything, and you're certainly not weak," Dr. Mitchell said firmly. "You have a real medical condition that requires real treatment. The fact that it took weeks to get proper diagnosis isn't a reflection of anything you did wrong. It's a reflection of systemic problems in how medicine approaches young women's pain." Dr. Mitchell stood and moved to a cabinet, retrieving what appeared to be a detailed treatment plan template. "I'm going to write you a comprehensive care plan that includes not just medication, but also physical therapy protocols, lifestyle modifications, and monitoring schedules. I'm also going to provide you with educational materials about your condition so you can be an informed advocate for yourself." As she worked on the treatment plan, Emma found herself studying Dr. Mitchell's face, looking for traces of the 17-year-old girl her grandmother had helped decades earlier. The resemblance was subtle but present. The same thoughtful expression, the same careful attention to detail, the same underlying strength that had helped her endure months of misdiagnosis. "Dr. Mitchell," Emma said, "can I ask you something? Personal, of course. When you were going through your diagnosis, did you ever feel angry? Not just about the pain, but about not being believed?" Dr. Mitchell paused in her writing and considered the question seriously. I felt many things during that period. Anger, yes, but also fear, frustration, and a growing sense that something was fundamentally wrong with how I was being treated. As a patient, she looked up at Marsha. But I also learned something important from your grandmother about the difference between being angry at injustice and using that anger constructively. Emma glanced between the two women, sensing a deeper story. What do you mean? Your grandmother showed me that advocacy doesn't require aggression, Dr. Mitchell explained. She was persistent without being confrontational, thorough without being disrespectful. She fought for me in a way that focused on getting results rather than winning arguments. Marsha's voice was quiet but carried decades of reflection. I learned something too, Sarah. I learned that sometimes fighting the system requires accepting personal consequences, but that doesn't make the fight less worthwhile. Dr. Mitchell finished writing and handed Emma a detailed treatment plan that was unlike anything she'd received from previous medical appointments. Instead of vague instructions to rest and take anti-inflammatories, this document outlined specific medications with dosing schedules, detailed monitoring requirements, physical therapy recommendations, and clear criteria for measuring improvement. This is your roadmap to remission, Dr. Mitchell said. But I want you to understand that having a treatment plan is just the beginning. Managing an autoimmune condition requires ongoing self-advocacy and active participation in your care. Emma studied the treatment plan, feeling overwhelmed by its comprehensiveness, but also grateful for the level of attention her case was finally receiving. What happens if the first medications don't work? Then we adjust the treatment approach until we find what does work, Dr. Mitchell replied without hesitation. Modern rheumatology has multiple therapeutic options, and we keep developing new ones. The days when patients had to simply endure chronic pain are largely behind us. She moved to her desk and pulled out what appeared to be a business card. But Emma noticed it had additional information handwritten on the back. This is my direct contact information, Dr. Mitchell said, handing the card to Emma. Not my office number, but my actual cell phone. I want you to call me if you have any concerns about your treatment, any questions about your condition, or if you encounter resistance from other healthcare providers. Emma stared at the card in amazement. You're giving me your personal phone number? 40 years ago, your grandmother risked her career to make sure I got proper medical care, Dr. Mitchell said simply. The least I can do is make sure you have access to the same level of advocacy and support. Marsha's voice carried wonder as she asked, Is this standard practice for your patients? Dr. Mitchell smiled. No, but Emma isn't a standard patient. She's the granddaughter of the nurse who taught me what patient advocacy really means. That makes her family. As their consultation was winding down, Dr. Mitchell made an unexpected request that would transform what had already been an extraordinary appointment into something approaching the miraculous. I'd like to show you both something, she said, moving to a locked cabinet in the corner of her office. Something I've been saving for an occasion that I thought might never come. She retrieved a framed photograph and set it on the desk facing Emma and Marsha. The image showed a large group of people in medical attire, standing in what appeared to be a modern clinic setting. A banner in the background reads Sarah Mitchell Center for Pediatric Autoimmune Disorders, opening day. This was taken 5 years ago when we opened the center, Dr. Mitchell explained. But I want you to look at something specific. She pointed to a smaller framed photograph visible on the wall behind the group. Even in the image, Emma could make out what appeared to be an old hospital ID badge. Is that? Marsha began. Your nursing badge from 1983, Dr. Mitchell confirmed. I've kept it all these years. It hangs in my office at the center, and I tell every resident and fellow who trains with us about the nurse who taught me that excellent patient care sometimes requires personal risk. Emma stared at the photograph, understanding the significance of what she was seeing. Her grandmother's professional identity, which had been stripped away by institutional politics 40 years earlier, had been preserved and honored by the patient whose life it had changed. But there's more, Dr. Mitchell continued, her voice taking on an excitement that made her seem younger. The center isn't just about treating individual patients, though we see about 300 children annually. We also train the next generation of pediatric rheumatologists and conduct research into improving diagnostic processes. She turned to her computer and pulled up what appeared to be a presentation slide. We've developed new screening protocols that have reduced average diagnostic time for juvenile arthritis from 18 months to 6 weeks. Those protocols are now being used in pediatric practices across the country. Marsha leaned forward to study the screen. 18 months was the average diagnostic delay? It still is in many parts of the country. But centers using our protocols are seeing dramatic improvements. Dr. Mitchell clicked to the next slide, which showed statistical data. We estimate that our diagnostic improvements have benefited approximately 12,000 children over the past 5 years. Emma felt goosebumps rising on her arms as she absorbed these numbers. 12,000 kids who didn't have to go through what you went through, what I've been going through. Exactly. And it all traces back to the lesson your grandmother taught me, that proper patient advocacy can change not just individual outcomes, but entire systems of care. Dr. Mitchell stood and moved to another cabinet. This one unlocked and retrieved what appeared to be a thick binder. This contains the research protocols and training materials we've developed, but I want to show you something specific. She opened the binder to a page that contained what looked like a formal acknowledgement section. Emma read aloud. This work is dedicated to Marsha Coleman, RN, whose courage in advocating for a teenage patient in 1983 demonstrated that excellence in nursing care requires both clinical competence and moral courage. Marsha's hand flew to her mouth, tears starting to flow freely for the first time since their reunion had begun. Sarah, you didn't need to. I needed to do much more than that, Dr. Mitchell interrupted gently. Your name should be on medical textbooks and nursing curricula. What you did should be taught as a case study in professional excellence. She returned to her desk and pulled out another document, this one bearing the official letterhead of Harvard Medical School, which is why I've taken the liberty of nominating you for an honorary recognition from my alma mater. The committee that reviews these nominations includes several faculty members who remember your case and have agreed that your contribution to medical practice deserves formal acknowledgement. Emma watched her grandmother's face cycle through disbelief, gratitude, and something that looked like the restoration of professional pride that had been damaged 40 years earlier. But the most important recognition, Dr. Mitchell continued, isn't institutional, it's personal. She gestured toward the group photograph again. Every person in that picture, every resident, every fellow, every research assistant knows your story. They know that they're part of a tradition of patient advocacy that began with a nurse who risked everything to help a teenager get proper medical care. Emma found her voice, though it was thick with emotion. How many people have you told Grandma's story to over the years? Hundreds, maybe thousands. Every time I teach a case conference about diagnostic challenges, every time I mentor a young physician who's struggling with institutional resistance, every time I encounter a patient who isn't being heard, I tell them about Marsha Coleman and what real advocacy looks like. Dr. Mitchell moved back to her computer and opened what appeared to be a photo album. And there's something else I want you both to see. The screen filled with images of children and teenagers, some in hospital beds, some at home, some participating in sports and other activities. Each photo was accompanied by a brief caption describing successful treatment outcomes. These are some of our patients over the past 5 years, Dr. Mitchell explained. Children who received early diagnosis and appropriate treatment for autoimmune conditions. She paused, letting the significance sink in. Every one of these success stories is connected to what you did for me 40 years ago, Marsha. Your willingness to break protocol for one patient created a ripple effect that has touched thousands of lives. Emma stared at the image's children, Emma's own age, who were playing sports, attending school, living normal lives because they'd received proper medical care. The scope of her grandmother's impact was almost incomprehensible. "I need you both to understand something," Dr. Mitchell said, her voice taking on the authority of someone who had spent decades thinking about these issues. What happened to Marsha in 1983 wasn't just a personal injustice. It was a symptom of systemic problems in healthcare that persist today. But what she accomplished despite those problems has helped change how we approach patient care. She closed the photo album and turned to face them directly. The center operates on principles that Marsha demonstrated 40 years ago. Believe patients, investigate thoroughly, advocate persistently, and put patient well-being above institutional convenience. Those principles are now part of our formal mission statement. Emma looked at her grandmother, seeing her not just as family, but as someone whose professional courage had created lasting change in ways she'd never known. "Grandma, do you understand what you did? Do you see how important your choice was?" Marsha wiped her eyes and looked around the office, at the medical texts, the patient photographs, the evidence of a career built on the foundation of compassionate care. "I'm beginning to," she said quietly. Dr. Mitchell moved to the group photograph and traced the outline of the nursing badge visible in the background. "That badge represents everything I've tried to build my career around: clinical excellence, patient advocacy, and the courage to challenge systems that aren't serving the people who need care." She turned back to Marsha with an expression of profound respect. "You gave me more than proper medical treatment 40 years ago. You gave me a template for what healthcare should be, and I've spent my entire career trying to live up to the standard you set." Emma felt something shifting in the room, not just understanding, but a sense of completion that had been missing for 4 decades. The circle was finally closing, connecting past sacrifice to present healing in ways none of them could have imagined. "Now," Dr. Mitchell said, her voice lightening with practical purpose, "let's make sure Emma gets the same quality of care that started this whole legacy." 3 months later, Emma stood on the sideline of her high school soccer field, wearing a volunteer badge that identified her as an assistant coach for the junior varsity team. Her playing days were behind her not because of ongoing pain, but because Dr. Mitchell's treatment plan had been so successful that Emma had discovered new interests beyond competitive athletics. The autoimmune condition that had threatened to derail her life had instead opened doors to possibilities she'd never considered. "How are you feeling today?" asked Jessica, one of the younger players who had sought Emma out after learning about her experience with medical advocacy. Emma had become something of a mentor to teammates dealing with their own health challenges, helping them understand when to push through normal discomfort and when to insist on proper medical evaluation. "Good," Emma replied, and she meant it completely. The morning stiffness that had defined her life for weeks was gone, replaced by the normal aches and energy fluctuations of any healthy teenager. More importantly, the anxiety about her symptoms and the frustration of not being believed had been replaced by confidence in her ability to advocate for herself and others. The transformation had began within 2 weeks of starting Dr. Mitchell's treatment plan. The anti-inflammatory medications had worked exactly as predicted, reducing her joint pain and systemic symptoms while allowing her to return to normal activities. But the greater healing had been emotional and relational. The restoration of trust in her own body and in the medical system's ability to provide appropriate care when approached with the right knowledge and persistence. Emma's phone buzzed with a text message from her grandmother. "Leaving for Boston in an hour. See you at dinner to celebrate." Today marked 3 months since Emma's diagnosis, but more significantly, It was the day Marsha would begin her new role as a volunteer patient advocate at the Sarah Mitchell Center. The position had emerged from conversations between Marsha and Dr. Mitchell about how to address the systemic problems that continued to plague young patients with autoimmune conditions. Marsha would work with families navigating diagnostic challenges, providing the kind of informed support and advocacy that she'd offered to Sarah 40 years earlier. It was a return to her professional calling, but with the wisdom and perspective that only decades of experience could provide. Emma's mother, Rebecca, had driven up from Connecticut the previous week to witness what she called the family miracle. Not just Emma's recovery, but her mother's professional renaissance. The 3 generations of women had spent an evening in Marsha's cottage kitchen, sharing stories and perspectives that had been shaped by Emma's medical journey. "I owe you both an apology," Rebecca had said, her corporate executive's composure softened by maternal concern. "I was so focused on Emma getting back to normal that I didn't really listen to what she was telling me about her pain. I made the same mistake the doctors made, assuming that teenage girls exaggerate symptoms for attention." Emma had recognized this admission as a form of healing that extended beyond medical treatment. Her family was learning to listen more carefully, to trust her assessment of her own experiences, and to advocate together rather than dismissing concerns that didn't fit convenient explanations. As the junior varsity practice concluded, Emma gathered the equipment with the efficiency she'd learned from helping her grandmother organize medical supplies. The parallels weren't lost on her. Both activities involved caring for people who needed support, paying attention to details that others might overlook, and being prepared for various contingencies. Her phone rang, and Dr. Mitchell's name appeared on the screen. They spoke regularly now, not about medical issues, but about Emma's growing interest in healthcare advocacy and possibly pursuing medicine herself. "Emma, how was practice today?" Dr. Mitchell asked, her voice carrying the warmth that had characterized their relationship since their first appointment. "Good. We have 3 new players who are recovering from various injuries, and I've been helping them understand the difference between normal healing pain and symptoms that need medical attention. That's exactly the kind of advocacy we need more of in youth sports," Dr. Mitchell said approvingly. "Speaking of advocacy, I have some news to share. The research paper we've been working on has been accepted for publication." Emma felt a surge of excitement. Over the past 2 months, she'd been collaborating with Dr. Mitchell on a research study examining the experiences of teenage girls with autoimmune conditions. Emma's perspective as a recent patient had provided insights that complemented Dr. Mitchell's clinical expertise, and their joint work was contributing to a growing body of literature about gender bias in medical care. The journal editor specifically mentioned that your patient perspective sections were among the strongest parts of the paper. Dr. Mitchell continued, "You have a real talent for translating complex medical experiences into language that can help both patients and providers understand what's at stake." Emma had discovered that her experience with medical dismissal, while painful, had given her a unique ability to articulate the challenges faced by young women seeking healthcare. Her writing about the psychological impact of not being believed had resonated with medical professionals who were working to address systemic bias in their own practices. "Dr. Mitchell," Emma said, "I've been thinking about something. My guidance counselor wants me to start considering college applications, and I'm wondering, do you think medicine might be the right path for me?" "I think," Dr. Mitchell replied carefully, "that medicine would be fortunate to have someone with your combination of personal experience, analytical intelligence, and commitment to advocacy. But I also think you should explore all your options before making that decision." Emma appreciated this measured response. Dr. Mitchell had been careful not to push her toward any particular career path, instead encouraging her to think broadly about ways to contribute to healthcare improvement. As Emma drove home to Marsha's cottage, she reflected on how profoundly her life had changed over the past few months. The teenager who had arrived in Maine with mysterious pain and growing despair had been replaced by someone with direction, purpose, and a clear understanding of her own capabilities and values. The cottage itself had been transformed as well. Where once it had been Marsha's retreat from professional life, it had become a hub of activity. Medical journals once again occupied the kitchen table, and the phone rang regularly with calls from families seeking guidance about their children's healthcare challenges. The Afghan that had symbolized quiet retirement now draped the chair where Marsha sat while conducting informal consultations with parents who had heard about her advocacy expertise. Emma found her grandmother in the kitchen, preparing dinner, with the methodical attention to detail that characterized everything she approached. But there was something different about her demeanor. The careful containment of earlier months had been replaced by an energy and engagement that spoke of rediscovered purpose. "How was your day?" Marsha asked, looking up from her preparation of fresh fish that had been delivered that morning by one of the local fishing families. "Productive," Emma replied, settling into her usual chair. Dr. Mitchell called with news about our research paper, and I spent some time thinking about college plans. Marsha paused in her cooking to give Emma her full attention. "What kind of thinking?" "I want to study medicine, but I also want to study writing and communication. I think there's a need for people who can bridge the gap between medical expertise and patient experience." "That sounds like a perfect combination of your strengths and interests," Marsha said. "And it sounds like something the healthcare system desperately needs." As they prepared dinner together, Emma found herself thinking about the interconnectedness of their experiences over the past few months. Her medical crisis had led to Marsha's professional reconnection, which had resulted in Dr. Mitchell's return to their lives, which had created opportunities for all of them to contribute to improving health care for others. "Grandma," Emma said, "do you think everything that happened was meant to happen? The timing of my symptoms, finding Sarah's letters, Dr. Mitchell being available to help us." Marsha considered this question as she had learned to consider all complex issues thoughtfully and without rushing to easy answers. "I think," she said finally, "that sometimes life presents us with opportunities to transform difficult experiences into something meaningful. Whether that's destiny or coincidence matters less than what we choose to do with those opportunities." Emma nodded, understanding that this perspective represented wisdom earned through decades of experience with both triumph and disappointment. As evening settled over the coastal cottage, 3 generations of women gathered around the kitchen table to share a meal and celebrate the various forms of healing that had taken place over the past 3 months. Emma's physical recovery was complete, but more importantly, old wounds had been acknowledged and addressed. Professional relationships had been restored, and new purposes had been discovered. The new volunteer badge that Marsha would wear beginning. The next week lay on the kitchen counter beside Emma's treatment plan, now largely ceremonial, since her symptoms had been in complete remission for 6 weeks. Both documents represented not just individual healing, but the kind of systemic change that occurs when people refuse to accept inadequate care as normal. Outside, the Maine coast continued its eternal conversation with the tides, but inside the cottage, the conversation was about the future, about how the lessons learned from one teenager's medical crisis could contribute to ensuring that other young people receive better care, earlier diagnosis, and more respectful treatment. As Emma helped clear the dinner dishes, she caught sight of her reflection in the kitchen window, a 16-year-old girl who had learned to advocate for herself and others, who understood both the challenges and possibilities within healthcare systems, and who was beginning to envision a future built on the foundation of compassionate care that her grandmother had demonstrated 40 years earlier. The circle had closed, but it had also opened new possibilities. What had begun as one nurse's advocacy for one patient had become a legacy of care that would continue to expand through the work of everyone it had touched. Emma understood now that healing was not just about treating disease, but about creating systems and relationships that prevented unnecessary suffering and promoted human dignity. The cottage settled into evening quiet, but it was the peaceful silence of resolution rather than retreat. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight there was only gratitude for the healing that had taken place and anticipation for the good work that lay ahead.